If you ever wondered what underappreciation looked like, then you're in luck, because this game is a textbook example of underappreciation. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 is the sequel to the reboot of the Castlevania franchise, developed by Mercury Steam and published by Konami for PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. When this came out, it was more or less savaged by critics in comparison to its prequel, which is astounding because this is a well-crafted game that made substantial improvements over Lords of Shadow 1, but with that being said, this is also a fairly flawed sequel. Easily one of the biggest issues with this game is its story and writing. The setting for this game is the present day, and it follows a depowered Dracula as he works with the necromancer Zobek, once again voiced by the wonderful Patrick Stewart, in stopping the acolytes of Satan in their quest to summon him from the bowels of hell. Now, the concept of playing as Dracula is a very attractive one, but since part of the story is Dracula getting back up to full power, the game never feels like the power trip it rightfully should be at times, most glaringly near the story's climax. This puts the story at odds with elements of the game's design, which I'll touch on later, but the bigger issue with the story is the dialogue and the setting itself.
Satan has specifically chosen this place for his return.
I won't say anything bad about the voice acting because the devs got some really talented people to lend their voices to this game, but the dialogue itself, ooh boy. It can be pretty underwhelming at times and actually has the potential to break immersion, like when Dracula awakens for the first time in centuries and Zobek mentions a pharmaceutical corporation.
This is the headquarters of a powerful pharmaceutical corporation. I suspect that one of the acolytes is operating from there.
Dracula doesn't ask what that is. In fact, he doesn't react to any of the modern creations of technology when you'd honestly expect him to, and a lot of what he does say is just really bland. This all comes together to make him come off as a really bland protagonist who's one note and flat out disinterested in the world around him. Then there's the modern day setting itself, which I'm actually not against. This is something I personally like. I love the modern urban cityscape combined with gothic high fantasy. This is a look the devs gave the game that I can wholeheartedly get behind. But it's the implications of this setting that's disconcerting to me. By setting the second main entry in the Lords of Shadow universe in the modern day, Mercury Steam essentially wrote the game's world into a creative corner, thanks largely due to major plot elements like Dracula killing off greater evils than himself, witnessing the end of the Belmonts.
No, you are the last Belmont.
And Dracula trying to permanently end his own life. The only way this world can be expanded upon would be by focusing on other elements beyond Dracula and the Belmonts, or by prequels set before or after the spin-off Mirror of Fate. But it's the gameplay that's the real star of the show, and it is friggin' good. Combat is still largely the same from the first game. Your main weapon is still a whip, but now it's one that's made from your own blood that can be swung vertically or horizontally, like before, and there's a decent array of enemies to go up against and plenty of combos to use against them. But there's a greater sense of tactics and planning here thanks to the inclusion of secondary weapons. Replacing the light and dark magic, we've now got the Void Sword and the Chaos Claws. The difference being is that while the whip covers most distances and has good reach, the other weapons are only good for enemies at close range. And the Void Sword, that heals you and is quicker, but it deals less damage. Whereas the Chaos Claws, they're slower, but they deal more damage and are necessary for tearing apart enemy armor and shields. Plus, you can use these to modify your vampiric abilities into all new attacks, like turning your blood daggers into ice blasts and fireballs, which is not only fun to dish out, but is really helpful when it comes to exploration and looking for secrets. However, one issue with the combat is a perceived lack of enemy variety. That isn't to say there isn't any variety, but you encounter the same bog-standard possessed humans so much, and the enemy designs almost all tend to borrow from the same color palette, that it feels like you're going up against the same enemies again and again, as they all just blur into the background as one indistinguishable mess. At least the enemies don't all deploy the same tactics, and they have enough unique abilities all their own to maintain a sense of persistent challenge. But it's the boss battles that offer the most challenge, and they are fun as hell. While there isn't anything wholly unique to them, they do put up the best challenge and spectacle in the entire game. Like when you're about to fight Satan, but first you have to reach him by scaling his giant worm monster as it's flying through space. It is disappointing though that the devs completely removed the Titan boss battles from the first game, but at least they incorporate the climbing aspect into different boss fights throughout the game. Exploration and platforming are what makes up the rest of the gameplay, and they're a pretty standard affair. Surfaces you can jump onto are highlighted by a chirping swarm of bats that's easy to spot, and the controls are tight and intuitive enough, and unlike the first game, you can actually freely move the camera, meaning you don't have an excuse for messing up the platforming puzzles other than yourself. And it also makes the game feel less like a God of War clone, which is a giant plus. The exploration, on the other hand, is no longer the linear stage-to-stage setup from the first game, but is now something that's trying to be more reminiscent of the Metroidvania variety, and it just flat-out fails, primarily due to the fact that we're never required to backtrack or explore for anything of importance. Plot-important MacGuffins are just given to you as you progress through the linear story. Sure, exploration is rewarded with things like upgrade gems, inventory upgrades, and keys to access challenges, but you're never really required to go after any of these things, and you can just get by with a few health and magic upgrades. Plus, you revisit a lot of the same areas as you move through the story, which not only renders the sort of hidden fast travel stations pointless, but eliminates any real need to backtrack, except in one instance where the game literally forces you to kill time while one character is looking for the last acolyte, or if you're running low on items and you need to go to the shop hidden in Dracula's castle.
Reach juice, sir.
There's also a bit of stealth thrown in where you have to avoid these big bad guys with grenade launchers, and while these are a nice change of pace, they all more or less follow the exact same formula. Distract, possess, hoof it, and maybe turn into a rat. This puts these sections at odds with not only being able to play as Dracula, arguably the most powerful being in any Castlevania universe, but also with the attempt at the Metroidvania exploration. Because guess what, these guards? You can't kill them at all, but they can kill you, which flies in the face of what Mercury's team were going for. At least you're never required to actually fight one, but it would have been interesting if you could eventually go toe-to-toe with one. And finally, there's the game's DLC. It sucks. Okay, that's not entirely true, but what is there? Well, you've got two different skins for Dracula, the dark and the armored one, and the ability to transform items in your inventory into different items. Aside from the item DLC, it's a pretty underwhelming package, especially when you compare it to what was available for a different game, Star Wars The Force Unleashed. See, in that game, you could get your hands on a crap ton of different skins of all sorts of characters, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, Darth Maul, or even just a random stormtrooper, and let you play that game not as Starkiller, but that character. So for Lords of Shadow 2, why didn't they come up with some more inspiring cosmetic DLC? Hell, they could have gone nuts and put in skins based on the Symphony of the Night version of Dracula, or one based on the original NES sprite of the titular vampire. That would have been awesome. But the cosmetic DLC that is here just screams laziness. Now, with that being said though, there is one piece of DLC that is definitively worth getting: the Revelations expansion. This expansion adds more to the main story by having you play as Dracula's son, Alucard, as he prepares for his father's return. The setting for this is Dracula's castle itself, which is made more into a character in of itself, primarily thanks to some ties to lore elaborated on in the main story. And Alucard himself, he controls pretty much the same as his dad, except he has his own combos for combat, and he's only got access to one weapon, his sword. But despite that, the combat is still enjoyable as it is in the main game. But this expansion does come off as more difficult thanks to some minor variations in enemy attacks, and the real challenge doesn't come from combat, it comes from puzzles and platforming, which is really the focus of this expansion. For the puzzles, Alucard has his own selection of vampiric powers like teleportation, turning into a wolf, and time manipulation. Unfortunately, these don't have any combat applications, but if nothing else, they are fun to fool around with as you learn how to apply them to the puzzles, which themselves are genuinely challenging brain scratches, and when you figure them out, it is a fantastic sense of accomplishment. The only real issue I can see for this expansion is that it's more aggressively linear than the main game, really short, and despite being called Revelations, it doesn't reveal every unelaborated aspect of the story like the magical echoes of characters who are supposed to be dead, but it still easily ends up being the only piece of DLC that's actually worth getting. As a whole package, Lords of Shadow 2 is a good game. It made substantial improvements over its prequel, and while not every change ended up being for the better, it still managed to be a fun hack-and-slash experience that's more true to its heritage. If you're a fan of Castlevania or just a casual onlooker, this game is worthy of at least a look if nothing else. Plus, from the way things are looking, it looks like this is going to be one of the few remaining games put out by Konami that's actually worth paying money for. Awesome, thank you for watching. If you really like this video, then how about you also like, favorite, and subscribe. And for the next couple game reviews, it's going to be Heroes of Might and Magic 6. I've been wanting to give that a go for a while. And Resident Evil 7. Here's a spoiler. It's really scary. Anyway, I've got all that and more coming up, so like always, don't forget to stick around.